In the 1970s, poor families bought 25 groceries that mattered. The food was cheap when paychecks ran short. Cyclamate sodas and lung meat weren't luxuries, they were survival. Then the FDA banned them. One by one, they made them illegal to sell. Let's uncover these 25 banned foods before the last generation that bought them forgets completely. In the early 1970s, poor families bought cyclamate diet sodas because they were the cheapest drinks in the store. A six-pack of Tab or Diet Right cost 69 cents at the supermarket, half the price of regular soda. Poor families on tight budgets bought cases of it to stretch their grocery money. Each can contain carbonated water, caramel color, phosphoric acid, sodium cyclamate, and saccharin. The cyclamate made it 40 times sweeter than sugar without adding any calories or cost. Kids drank it at dinner, parents served it to guests, and families on food stamps kept it stocked in the refrigerator. Then, in October 1969, scientists at the University of Wisconsin discovered that cyclamate caused bladder tumors in laboratory rats. The FDA banned cyclamate completely in February 1970. Coca-Cola and Royal Crown reformulated their diet sodas with saccharin alone, but the taste turned bitter and sales dropped. The cheap, sweet cyclamate formula poor families depended on vanished overnight from every grocery store shelf. In the 1970s, poor families bought animal lungs because they were the cheapest protein available. Beef, pork, and lamb lungs cost 20 cents a pound at ethnic butcher shops and supermarket meat counters, compared to $1 for ground beef. Poor families stretched their food budgets by using lungs in stews, soups, Scottish haggis, Mexican tacos de bofe, and ground meat mixtures. The lungs were nutritious, containing protein, iron, and B vitamins. Immigrant families had cooked with them for generations in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. A single pound of lungs could feed a family of 4 for under $1 when combined with rice, beans, and vegetables. Then in 1971, the USDA banned the sale of animal lungs for human consumption because lungs could harbor dust, bacteria, and stomach contents during slaughter. Butchers stopped selling them immediately, and poor families lost access to one of their cheapest protein sources. The lung meat that had sustained poor families through lean times disappeared from American butcher counters. In the 1970s, poor families bought hundreds of cheap grocery items that contained red dye no 2 because the bright colors made inexpensive food look appealing. Generic cherry gelatin cost 19 cents a box, strawberry cake mix cost 49 cents, red hard candy cost 5 cents, and fruit punch mix cost under $1. The synthetic coal tar dye was in everything poor families ate: breakfast cereals, hot dogs, ice cream, macaroni and cheese, pickles, canned fruit, and frozen dinners. Poor families chose these brightly colored products because kids would actually eat them without complaining. Children ate red dye no 2 multiple times every single day without anyone knowing it was in their food. Then in 1976, the FDA banned red dye no 2 after studies proved it caused malignant tumors in laboratory rats. Food manufacturers reformulated thousands of products with red dye no 40, and grocery prices increased 10 to 15% overnight. The cheap, brightly colored foods poor families depended on disappeared from shelves and were replaced with more expensive versions. In the 1970s, poor families in the rural South bought sassafras root bark because it was the cheapest way to make tea and homemade root beer. Roadside stands, health food stores, and farmers' markets sold it for 50 cents a pound. Poor families brewed sassafras tea that cost pennies per serving instead of buying expensive coffee or store-bought tea bags. Sassafras tea was a traditional Appalachian remedy for colds, fever, spring tonic, and blood purification that poor families drank daily. The roots contained saffrole oil, which gave the tea its distinctive spicy, earthy, vanilla licorice flavor that masked the taste of cheap well water. Many poor families harvested sassafras roots from the woods for free or bought them from local foragers at roadside stands for pocket change. A single pound of sassafras roots could make 20 cups of tea. Then in 1960, the FDA banned saffron as a food additive after studies showed it caused liver cancer in laboratory rats and mice. Commercial sales of sassafras root bark for human consumption became restricted and eventually vanished from markets. The cheap sassafras tea poor families drank disappeared. In the 1970s, poor rural families bought raw, unpasteurized milk directly from small dairies and farm stands because it cost half the price of store-bought pasteurized milk. A gallon of raw milk cost 79 cents straight from the farmer, compared to $1.50 for pasteurized milk at the supermarket. Poor families on tight budgets saved 71 cents per gallon by buying raw milk, a significant savings when feeding large families. The fresh, creamy raw milk came straight from the cow with no processing costs or middlemen taking a cut. Poor families used raw milk for drinking, cooking, baking, making homemade butter and cheese, and feeding children who needed calcium and protein. Farmers sold it legally in most states with minimal regulation, and families trusted the local dairy they had bought from for years. Then, throughout the 1980s, state and federal health agencies restricted raw milk sales because of bacterial contamination risks, including Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, and tuberculosis. In 1987, the FDA banned interstate sales of raw milk completely. The cheap raw milk poor families depended on vanished from farm stands and local dairies overnight. Cyclamate sodas, lung meat, red dye no-2 foods, sassafras root bark, raw milk, 5 groceries that kept poor families fed when money ran short. They weren't luxuries, they were survival. Then, the government banned them all. 20 more banned groceries remain. In the 1970s, poor families bought the cheapest cuts of meat at the supermarket, and every single piece was stamped with Violet No. 1. A purple vegetable dye that proved the meat had passed USDA inspection. The violet stamp was visible on chuck roast, pork shoulder, beef shank, and every budget cut poor families could afford. Butchers applied the dye using rubber rollers directly onto the meat surface, and the USDA told consumers the stamp was completely edible and harmless. Poor families never questioned it. The violet mark meant the meat was safe to eat and legal to sell. They bought stamped chuck roast for 89 cents a pound, far cheaper than unmarked premium cuts that cost twice as much. The stamp appeared on every piece of inspected meat sold in America, and poor families ate it without a second thought, cutting around it sometimes, but usually just cooking it right into the pot roast or stew. Then, in the early 1970s, Japanese researchers discovered that Violet No. 1 caused cancer in laboratory animals when consumed regularly. American toxicologists reviewed the data and raised serious concerns. In 1973, the USDA banned Violet No. 1 from use on meat and switched to natural vegetable-based dyes derived from beets. Meat packers reformulated their stamps overnight, and the violet-stamped meat poor families had eaten for decades disappeared from butcher counters. The new stamps were red or green, but most consumers never noticed. For poor families who had trusted that purple stamp as proof their cheap meat was safe, the ban was another reminder that nothing was truly. In the 1970s, poor families bought the cheapest hot dogs at the supermarket, and those hot dogs had bright orange casings colored with Orange B, a synthetic petroleum-based dye. A package of 8 Orange B hot dogs cost 49 cents, compared to 79 cents for natural casing franks. Poor families bought the cheap orange hot dogs by the case because they were affordable protein that kids would eat without complaining. The orange color signaled affordability and became a visual marker of budget-friendly meat. The hot dogs contained mechanically separated chicken or pork, water, corn syrup, salt, sodium nitrite, and casings soaked in orange bee dye solution during manufacturing. The dye was applied by soaking casings in orange bee, water, and sodium chloride until they turned glowing orange. The FDA approved orange bee in 1966 exclusively for hot dog casings, and by the early 1970s nearly every budget brand used it. Poor families grilled these orange hot dogs at barbecues, boiled them for quick dinners, and served them at birthday parties. Kids ate them on white bread with mustard, never questioning the traffic cone orange color. Then, in the mid-1970s, studies showed orange bee caused tumors in rats and dogs. In 1978, the FDA banned orange bee completely. Manufacturers had 6 months to reformulate. Oscar Mayer and Ballpark switched to natural casings or paprika extract. The glowing orange hot dogs disappeared, replaced by Frank's with natural tan or pale orange casings. For poor families who ate orange bee hot dogs multiple times weekly, in the 1970s, poor families bought jars of bright red maraschino cherries because they were the cheapest way to make desserts look fancy. A jar cost 89 cents, and poor families used them to top ice cream sundaes, decorate cakes, and add color to fruit cocktail and Jell-O salads. The cherries were bleached white with sulfur dioxide, then soaked in water, high fructose corn syrup, almond extract, and red dye No. 4. A synthetic coal tar dye that turned them glowing crimson. Kids loved them because they tasted like pure sugar and stained their lips red for hours. Poor families kept jars stocked year-round because they lasted months and made plain vanilla ice cream feel special. Maraschino cherries were invented in the early 1900s using sulfur dioxide bleaching and synthetic dyes. By the 1970s, they were a dessert staple, used in countless recipes and served at soda fountains and home kitchens. Poor families relied on them as an affordable way to make meals festive, especially for children's birthdays. Then in the mid-1970s, studies showed red dye No. 4 caused health problems in laboratory dogs. On January 23, 1976, the FDA banned red dye No. 4 completely. Cherry processors switched to red dye No. 40 and erythrocene. The reformulation took months, and bright red cherries disappeared from shelves. When they returned, the color was duller and less vibrant. For poor families who had used red dye No. 4 cherries to make cheap desserts special. In the 1970s, poor families bought canned fruits packed in cyclamate syrup because they were the cheapest way to serve fruit to children who refused to eat fresh produce. A can of cyclamate sweetened peaches, pears, or fruit cocktail cost 39 cents, compared to 69 cents for the sugar syrup version. Poor families on tight budgets bought the cyclamate version by the case because it tasted just as sweet as regular canned fruit but cost nearly half the price. The cans were labeled diet or light, but poor families bought them not for dieting. They bought them because they were cheaper and their kids would actually eat them. Each can contain fruit pieces packed in water, artificial flavoring, and sodium cyclamate, the synthetic sweetener that was 40 times sweeter than sugar and cost pennies to produce. The cyclamate syrup made the fruit taste candy sweet without adding any calories or sugar, which appealed to parents who worried about their children's teeth and weight. Poor families served cyclamate canned fruit as dessert, mixed it into Jell-O salads, spooned it over ice cream, and packed it in school lunches. Kids loved the sweet taste and never knew they were eating diet food. The fruit was soft, easy to chew, and required no preparation. Just open the can, drain the syrup, and serve. A single can could stretch to feed 3 or 4 children as an after-school snack or dessert. Then in October 1969, scientists discovered that cyclamate caused bladder tumors in laboratory rats when consumed regularly. The FDA reviewed the evidence and determined that cyclamate was unsafe for human consumption at any level. On October 18, 1969, the agency announced a complete ban on cyclamate in all food products, effective February 1, 1970. The ban applied to diet sodas, tabletop sweeteners, baked goods, candy, and canned fruits. Food manufacturers were given just a few months to reformulate their products or pull them from shelves entirely. Canned fruit companies scrambled to comply. Some switched to saccharin, which had a bitter aftertaste that kids hated. Others switched to sugar syrup, which raised the price significantly. Many brands discontinued their diet or light fruit lines entirely because the reformulation costs were too high. By spring 1970, cyclamate-sweetened canned fruits had completely vanished from grocery store shelves. In the 1970s, poor families bought margarine instead of butter because it cost half as much and came in larger tubs. A 1-pound tub of margarine cost 49 cents, compared to 99 cents for a pound of butter. Poor families spread margarine on toast, used it for cooking and baking, and served it at every meal because it was the only fat they could afford. The margarine was made from partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, usually soybean, corn, or cottonseed oil, that had been chemically processed to turn liquid oil into solid fat. The hydrogenation process created trans fats, artificial fats that gave margarine its solid texture, long shelf life, and butter-like consistency. Each tablespoon of 1970s margarine contained 2 to 3 grams of trans fats, and poor families used it liberally because it was cheap and versatile. Food manufacturers marketed margarine as a healthy alternative to butter, claiming it was lower in saturated fat and cholesterol. Doctors recommended it to patients with heart disease, and the American Heart Association endorsed it as heart-healthy. Poor families believed the health claims and felt good about choosing margarine over butter. They were saving money and supposedly protecting their hearts at the same time. They had no idea that the trans fats in margarine were far more dangerous than the saturated fats in butter. Trans fats raised LDL cholesterol, lowered HDL cholesterol, increased inflammation, and dramatically raised the risk of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. Poor families used margarine for everything. They spread it on toast and sandwiches, stirred it into mashed potatoes and vegetables, used it to grease pans for baking, and melted it over popcorn. They bought it in bulk because it was cheap and lasted for months in the refrigerator without spoiling. A single tub of margarine could last a family of 4 for 2 weeks, making it one of the most economical staples in the pantry. Then in the 1990s and early 2000s, scientists finally understood how dangerous trans fats really were. Studies showed that trans fats were responsible for tens of thousands of heart attacks and deaths every year. In 2015, the FDA determined that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer safe for human consumption and gave food manufacturers 3 years to remove them from all products. On June 18, 2018, the FDA banned partially hydrogenated oils completely, making it illegal to manufacture or sell any food containing artificial trans fats. Margarine manufacturers reformulated their products, replacing partially hydrogenated oils with palm oil, coconut oil, and other fats. The new margarine had a different texture and flavor, and some longtime users complained it didn't taste the same. But the old margarine, the cheap trans fat-loaded margarine poor families had spread on toast and cooked with for decades, was gone forever. Cyclamate canned fruits, trans fat margarine, 2 more banned groceries that kept poor families fed when money was tight. 10 groceries down. Each one was cheap, each one was trusted, and each one was eventually proven unsafe. In the 1970s, poor families bought generic cake mixes because they were the cheapest way to make birthday cakes and desserts for special occasions. A box of strawberry or cherry cake mix cost 49 cents at the supermarket, compared to $1.29 for a bakery cake. Poor families baked these bright red cakes for children's birthdays, holidays, and church potlucks because they looked festive and tasted sweet, and nobody could tell they were made from a bargain brand mix. Each box contained flour, sugar, leavening agents, artificial flavoring, and red dye No. 2, the synthetic coal tar dye that turned the cake batter and finished cake a vivid, almost neon red. The dye was so concentrated that a single slice of cake could stain a child's lips and tongue bright red for hours. Poor families loved these cake mixes because they were foolproof. Just add eggs, oil, and water, mix, pour into a pan, and bake. Even mothers who couldn't bake from scratch could produce a decent cake using a box mix, and the bright red color made the cake look special and homemade. Kids begged for red velvet cake, strawberry cake, and cherry chip cake at every birthday, and poor families obliged because the mixes were affordable and easy. The cakes were served at birthday parties, bake sales, school functions, and family gatherings. Everyone ate them without question, assuming the bright red color came from natural ingredients like strawberries or cherries. But the red color came entirely from red dye No. 2, a synthetic dye that had been used in American food products since the 1940s. By the 1970s, the dye was in hundreds of products, and Americans, especially children, were consuming it daily in cereals, candies, drinks, and baked goods. Then, in the early 1970s, toxicologists began reviewing decades of safety studies on red dye No. 2 and discovered troubling patterns. Soviet researchers had published studies showing the dye caused malignant tumors in laboratory rats when fed in doses equivalent to regular human consumption. American scientists replicated the studies and found similar results. The dye was linked to cancer, chromosomal damage, and reproductive harm. In 1976, after years of controversy and mounting evidence, the FDA banned red dye No. 2 from all food products. The ban was immediate and comprehensive, affecting thousands of products including cake mixes. Manufacturers were required to reformulate their products using red dye No. 40, a newer synthetic dye the FDA considered safer. The reformulation process took months, and during that time, red cake mixes disappeared from grocery store shelves. Bakeries and home cooks scrambled to find alternatives, and many birthday parties that year featured yellow or chocolate cakes instead of the traditional bright red ones. In the 1970s and early 1980s, poor families bought cheap grape-flavored drinks because they were the most affordable way to give kids something sweet to drink besides water. A 2-liter bottle of generic grape soda cost 59 cents, and a canister of grape drink mix powder cost under $1 and made 2 gallons. Poor families bought these products by the case and the canister because they were far cheaper than milk, juice, or brand-name sodas. The drinks were artificially flavored and colored, containing water, high-fructose corn syrup, citric acid, artificial grape flavoring, and cinnamyl anthranilate. Cinnamyl anthranilate was cheap to manufacture and incredibly potent. Just a few drops could flavor an entire batch of soda or drink mix. It became the industry standard for grape-flavored products throughout the 1970s because it delivered a powerful candy-like grape flavor that kids loved and parents could afford. Poor families served grape drinks at every meal, packed them in school lunches, and handed them out at birthday parties and backyard barbecues. Kids drank gallons of it every week, their tongues and lips stained purple, never questioning what made the flavor so intense. The drinks were ubiquitous in poor and working-class households. They were sold at every grocery store, corner store, and gas station, and they came in dozens of brands. Shasta, Faygo, store brand sodas, Kool-Aid, Flavor Aid, and countless generic drink mixes. The grape flavor was always the most popular because it tasted the sweetest and most artificial, closer to candy than fruit. Poor families trusted these drinks because they were cheap, widely available, and endorsed by major food companies. Then, in the early 1980s, toxicologists conducting feeding studies on laboratory mice discovered that cinnamyl anthranilate caused severe liver damage and hepatocellular carcinoma when consumed in doses equivalent to regular human consumption. The chemical was metabolized in the liver into compounds that damaged DNA and triggered uncontrolled cell growth. Additional studies on rats confirmed the findings, showing tumors, organ damage, and reproductive harm. In 1982, the FDA reviewed the data and concluded that cinnamyl anthranilate was unsafe for use in food products. On March 15, 1982, the agency banned the chemical as a food additive, prohibiting its use in all foods, beverages, candies, and chewing gums. Beverage companies were forced to reformulate all grape-flavored products immediately. Most switched to methylanthranilate, a naturally occurring compound found in Concord grapes that was considered safer. But methylanthranilate was more expensive and produced a weaker, less intense flavor. In the 1970s and 1980s, poor families bought fresh produce from salad bars, grocery store displays, and restaurant buffets, and nearly all of it was treated with sulfites to keep it looking fresh. Sulfites, sulfur dioxide, sodium sulfite, sodium bisulfite, and potassium metabisulfite were sprayed or soaked onto cut fruits, vegetables, and salad greens to prevent browning, wilting, and discoloration. The chemicals kept lettuce crisp and green, kept sliced apples and potatoes white, and kept guacamole and avocados from turning brown. Poor families didn't know the produce had been treated with sulfites because there were no labeling requirements. They simply bought the freshest-looking produce they could afford and assumed it was safe. Sulfites were widely used throughout the food industry because they were cheap, effective, and EFTA approved. Grocery stores sprayed them on produce displays multiple times a day to keep everything looking fresh under the lights. Restaurants soaked cut vegetables in sulfite solution before serving them at salad bars and buffets. Even dried fruits, frozen potatoes, and canned vegetables were treated with sulfites to preserve color and texture. Americans consumed sulfites daily without knowing it, and for most people the chemicals caused no problems. But for people with asthma, especially severe asthma, sulfites were deadly. When asthmatics consumed sulfite-treated food, the chemicals triggered severe allergic reactions, difficulty breathing, wheezing, throat swelling, hives, anaphylaxis, and in some cases, death. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, emergency rooms across America treated dozens of cases of severe asthma attacks triggered by sulfite-treated food. Many victims had eaten at salad bars or restaurant buffets where the produce had been heavily treated with sulfites to keep it looking fresh. Some victims died before they could reach the hospital. By the mid-1980s, the FDA had documented at least 13 deaths directly linked to sulfite consumption, and advocacy groups demanded action. In 1986, the FDA banned the use of sulfites on fresh fruits and vegetables intended to be sold or served raw to consumers. The ban applied to salad bars, grocery store-produced displays, and restaurant buffets. Sulfites were still allowed in processed foods, dried fruits, and wine, but they had to be labeled. The ban forced restaurants and grocery stores to change their practices overnight. Produce displays no longer looked as fresh and vibrant, lettuce wilted faster, and cut fruits browned within hours. Some businesses complained that the ban hurt sales because consumers preferred the bright, fresh-looking sulfite-treated produce. In the 1970s, poor families bought canned foods because they were the cheapest, longest-lasting groceries available. Canned vegetables, fruits, soups, and meats cost pennies per serving and lasted for years in the pantry without refrigeration. Poor families stocked their shelves with dozens of cans because canned food was affordable, convenient, and reliable. A can of green beans cost 19 cents, a can of tomato soup cost 25 cents, and a can of tuna cost 39 cents. Families on tight budgets could feed themselves for weeks on canned goods alone. But nearly every can sold in the 1970s was sealed with lead solder, a metal alloy used to join the seams of tin cans. The lead solder created an airtight seal that kept food fresh, but it also leached lead into the food inside, especially acidic foods like tomatoes, citrus fruits, and pickled vegetables. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that causes irreversible brain damage, developmental delays, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and organ damage. Children are especially vulnerable because their developing brains absorb lead more readily than adults. Poor families who relied heavily on canned foods throughout the 1970s unknowingly exposed themselves and their children to dangerous levels of lead. The more canned food they ate, the more lead accumulated in their bodies. Children who grew up eating canned vegetables, canned fruit, and canned soup multiple times a day absorbed lead with every meal. The lead settled in their bones, damaged their nervous systems, and caused problems that wouldn't be diagnosed until years later: lower IQ, difficulty concentrating, hyperactivity, aggression, and learning disabilities. Scientists began raising concerns about lead-soldered cans in the late 1970s, and by the early 1980s, the evidence was overwhelming. Studies showed that Americans who ate canned foods regularly had significantly higher blood lead levels than those who ate fresh or frozen foods. In 1991, the FDA effectively banned lead solder in food cans by setting a maximum lead level so low that lead-soldered cans could no longer meet the standard. Can manufacturers switch to welded steel cans and aluminum cans, both of which were lead-free? The transition took several years, and by 1995, lead-soldered cans had almost completely disappeared from American grocery stores. In the 1970s, poor families bought cheap cheese at ethnic markets, farmers' markets, and roadside stands, and much of it was made from raw unpasteurized milk and aged for only a few weeks. Fresh cheeses like queso fresco, panela, and farmer's cheese were especially popular in Hispanic and immigrant communities because they were affordable, flavorful, and traditional. A pound of fresh unpasteurized cheese cost $1 compared to $2 for pasteurized cheese at the supermarket. Poor families used the cheese in tacos, quesadillas, salads, and sandwiches, and served it at every meal because it was one of the few affordable sources of protein and calcium they could buy. The cheese was made by small-scale dairies and home cheesemakers who followed traditional methods passed down through generations. They used raw milk from local cows or goats, added rennet and salt, and let the cheese age for 2 to 4 weeks before selling it. The short aging time meant the cheese was soft, mild, and fresh-tasting, but it also meant that any harmful bacteria in the raw milk, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, Brucella, had not been killed by aging. Pasteurization would have killed the bacteria, but pasteurization was expensive and required equipment that small producers couldn't afford. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, public health officials documented dozens of outbreaks of listeriosis, salmonellosis, and brucellosis linked to unpasteurized fresh cheese. Pregnant women who ate contaminated cheese suffered miscarriages and stillbirths. Infants and elderly people became seriously ill and sometimes died. Poor families who bought cheap unpasteurized cheese to feed their children unknowingly put them at risk of life-threatening infections. In 1987, the FDA tightened regulations on cheese made from unpasteurized milk, requiring that all raw milk cheese be aged for at least 60 days before sale. The 60-day aging requirement was based on research showing that harmful bacteria die off naturally during aging if the cheese is properly handled and stored. Cheeses aged for 60 days or longer were considered safe even if made from raw milk. But fresh cheeses aged less than 60 days were no longer legal unless made from pasteurized milk. The regulation effectively banned the cheap, fresh, unpasteurized cheeses poor families had relied on for decades. Small dairies and home cheesemakers either switched to pasteurized milk, which raised sloths, or stopped making cheese altogether. The fresh, unpasteurized cheeses disappeared from ethnic markets and roadside stands, replaced by more expensive pasteurized versions or imported cheeses that met the 60-day aging requirement. Red dye No 2 cake mixes, cinnamol anthranilate grape drinks, sulfite preserved produce, lead soldered canned foods, unpasteurized fresh cheese, 5 more banned groceries that poor families trusted and ate without question. 15 down. 10 more remain. In the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, poor families bought thousands of food products that contained red dye No. 3, a synthetic dye that made foods bright pink and cherry red. The dye was in cheap candy, cake decorations, maraschino cherries, canned fruit cocktail, ice cream toppings, breakfast cereals, and countless other products poor families bought because they were affordable and colorful. Red dye No. 3, also called erythrocene, was especially popular in candy because it produced a vibrant, eye-catching color that made cheap candy look more appealing to children. Poor families bought red dye No. 3 candy by the bagful at dollar stores, discount grocers, and bulk bins because it cost pennies per pound and kept kids happy. The dye had been approved by the FDA in 1907 and used in American food products for over a century. By the 1970s, it was one of the most widely used synthetic dyes in the food industry, second only to red dye No. 40. Americans consumed red dye No. 3 daily in breakfast cereals, candy, baked goods, beverages, and processed foods. The dye was cheap to produce, stable at high temperatures, and produced a bright, appealing color that boosted sales. But by the 1980s, scientists had accumulated troubling evidence about red dye No. 3. Studies showed that the dye caused thyroid tumors in laboratory rats when fed in high doses over long periods. The tumors were benign in some studies and malignant in others, but the pattern was consistent. Red dye No. 3 damaged the thyroid gland and triggered abnormal cell growth. Additional studies suggested the dye might interfere with thyroid hormone production and affect neurodevelopment in children. In 1990, the FDA took the unusual step of banning red dye No. 3 from cosmetics and externally applied drugs, citing cancer concerns. But the agency allowed the dye to remain in food and ingested drugs, arguing that the cancer risk from eating red dye No. 3 was lower than the risk from applying it to skin. The decision created a confusing double standard. In 1990, the FDA took the unusual step of banning red dye No. 3 from cosmetics and externally applied drugs, citing cancer concerns. But the agency allowed the dye to remain in food and ingested drugs, arguing that the cancer risk from eating red dye No. 3 was lower than the risk from applying it to skin. The decision created a confusing double standard. The dye was too dangerous to put on your lips, but safe enough to eat. Consumer advocacy groups protested the inconsistency and demanded a complete ban. But the FIFTA took no action for over 3 decades. Poor families continued buying red dye no. 3 products throughout the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and early 2020s, unaware that the dye was banned in cosmetics but still allowed in food. Their children ate red dye no. 3 candy, cereal, and cake decorations multiple times a week, accumulating exposure over years. Then on January 15, 2025, after decades of pressure from health advocates and mounting scientific evidence, the FDA finally revoked the approval of red dye no. 3 for use in all food and ingested drugs. The ban gave food manufacturers until January 18, 2027 to reformulate their products and remove the dye. Candy companies, cereal makers, and food processors scrambled to comply, replacing red dye no. 3 with red dye no. 40. Natural colorants, or no dye at all. By 2027, red dye no 3 foods will be completely illegal to manufacture or sell in the United States. In the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, poor families bought thousands of food products made with partially hydrogenated oils because they were the cheapest fats available. Margarine, shortening, crackers, cookies, snack cakes, microwave popcorn, frozen dinners, fried foods, and baked goods all contained partially hydrogenated oils, and poor families bought them because they were affordable, shelf-stable, and widely available. A box of crackers made with partially hydrogenated oils cost 99 cents, compared to $2 for crackers made with butter or healthier oils. Poor families chose the cheaper option every time because their budgets left no room for premium products. Partially hydrogenated oils were created through an industrial process that added hydrogen atoms to liquid vegetable oils, turning them into solid or semi-solid fats. The hydrogenation process extended shelf life, improved texture, and reduced costs, making it a favorite of food manufacturers throughout the 20th century. But the process also created trans fats, artificial fats that had no safe level of consumption. Trans fats raised LDL cholesterol, lowered HDL cholesterol, increased inflammation, and dramatically raised the risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and early death. Food companies used partially hydrogenated oils in everything because they were cheap and versatile. Poor families, they had no idea they were eating poison. Food labels listed partially hydrogenated oil in the ingredient list, but most consumers didn't know what that meant or why it mattered. By the 1990s, scientists understood how dangerous trans fats really were. Studies showed that trans fats were responsible for tens of thousands of heart attacks and deaths every year in the United States alone. Countries around the world began banning or restricting trans fats, but the United States moved slowly. In 2015, the FDA finally determined that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer generally recognized as safe and gave food manufacturers 3 years to remove them from all products. On June 18, 2018, the FDA banned partially hydrogenated oils completely, making it illegal to manufacture or sell any food containing artificial trans fats above trace levels. Studies estimated that banning trans fats would prevent tens of thousands of heart attacks and save thousands of lives every year. In the 1970s and 1980s, poor families bought white rice because it was the cheapest staple food available. Poor families cooked rice multiple times a week to stretch meals, serving it alongside beans, vegetables, and small amounts of meat. Rice was filling, shelf-stable, and universally liked by children. But much of the white rice sold in the 1970s and 1980s was coated with mineral oil to give it a shiny, polished appearance. Mineral oil is a petroleum-based product, a byproduct of crude oil refining, that was applied to rice during processing to prevent the grains from sticking together, to make them look whiter and brighter, and to extend shelf life. The coating was invisible, flavorless, and undetectable to consumers. Food manufacturers used mineral oil because it was cheap and effective, and the FDA allowed it as a food additive in small amounts. But mineral oil is not digestible. When consumed, it passes through the digestive system unchanged, coating the intestinal walls and preventing the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. People who ate mineral oil-coated rice regularly risked vitamin deficiencies, digestive problems, and long-term health issues. Children were especially vulnerable because their growing bodies needed those vitamins for proper development. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, health advocates raised concerns about mineral oil in food, arguing that a non-digestible petroleum product had no place in human diets. By the 1990s, mounting evidence showed that mineral oil could accumulate in the liver, spleen, and lymph nodes and might be linked to cancer. Today, white rice is polished using mechanical methods and food-grade vegetable oils instead of mineral oil. In the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, poor families bought cheap citrus-flavored sodas and sports drinks that contained brominated vegetable oil, a chemical additive used to keep flavoring oils suspended in liquid. Orange soda, grapefruit soda, Mountain Dew, Gatorade, and Powerade all contained brominated vegetable oil, and poor families bought them by the 2-liter bottle and the case because they were affordable, sweet, and popular with kids. A 2-liter bottle of orange soda cost 79 cents, compared to $2 for a bottle of juice. Poor families chose soda because it was cheaper and lasted longer. Brominated vegetable oil, VO, was created by bonding vegetable oil to bromine. After cyclamate was banned in 1970, saccharin became the only artificial sweetener available, and poor families depended on it to sweeten coffee, tea, and foods without spending money on sugar. Then in 1977, Canadian scientists published a study showing that saccharin caused bladder cancer in laboratory rats. The study triggered alarm bells at the EFTA, which was required by the Delaney Clause to ban any food additive. On March 9, 1977, the EFTA announced its intention to ban saccharin entirely, effective July 1977. The announcement sparked immediate public outrage. Poor families panicked because saccharin was the only sweetener they could afford. Cyclamate was already banned. Aspartame wouldn't be approved until 1981. If saccharin was banned, poor families would have no affordable way to sweeten their coffee, tea, or food. They would be forced to buy expensive sugar or go without. Congress responded to the public outcry by passing the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act in November 1977, which placed a moratorium on the EFTA's proposed ban and required warning labels on all saccharin products instead. The label read, "Use of this product may be hazardous to your health. This product contains saccharin, which has been determined to cause cancer in laboratory animals." The warning label stayed on saccharin products for over 20 years, frightening consumers but allowing the sweetener to remain on the market. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, scientists conducted additional studies on saccharin and concluded that the bladder cancer risks seen in rats did not apply to humans due to biological differences. In 2000, the U.S. government officially removed saccharin from its list of carcinogens, and the warning labels were finally dropped. Saccharin was declared safe for human consumption, and poor families could finally stop worrying that their morning coffee sweetener was killing them. In the 1970s, poor families ate fish from local lakes, rivers, and coastal waters because it was free protein they could catch themselves or buy cheaply at dockside fish markets. Freshwater fish like bass, catfish, and trout, and saltwater fish like mackerel and bluefish were affordable, abundant, and nutritious. Poor families fried the fish, baked it, or made fish stew, serving it multiple times a week to stretch their food budgets. Fishing was also a way for poor families to feed themselves without relying on expensive grocery stores. But throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, American waterways were heavily contaminated with DIT, a powerful pesticide that had been used extensively in agriculture and mosquito control since the 1940s. DET didn't break down in the environment. It persisted in soil and water for decades, accumulating in the fatty tissues of fish and other wildlife. Fish in contaminated waters absorb DET from the water and from eating contaminated smaller fish. The bigger and older the fish, the more DET it contained. People who ate DET-contaminated fish regularly, especially poor families who relied on locally caught fish as a dietary staple, accumulated dangerous levels of DET in their own bodies. DET is a probable human carcinogen linked to liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, and breast cancer. It's also an endocrine disruptor that interferes with hormone function, causing reproductive problems, developmental delays, and neurological damage. Pregnant women who ate DET-contaminated fish passed the chemical to their developing babies, causing birth defects and developmental problems. In 1972, the EPA banned DET for agricultural use in the United States, but the chemical remained in the environment for decades. Fish in contaminated lakes and rivers continued to carry high levels of DET throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and even into the 1990s. State health departments issued fish consumption advisories warning people, especially pregnant women and children, not to eat fish from contaminated waters. But many poor families never saw the advisories or couldn't afford to stop eating the fish. By the 2000s, DET levels in American fish had finally dropped to safer levels as the chemical slowly broke down in the environment. In the 1970s and 1980s, poor families, especially Hispanic and immigrant families, used traditional pottery bowls, jars, and plates to store and serve food. The pottery was handmade in Mexico, Central America, and other countries, and sold at ethnic markets, swap meets, and roadside stands for a few dollars per piece. The pottery was beautiful, colorful, and functional, and poor families used it daily for storing beans, rice, salsa, pickled vegetables, and leftovers. The pottery was glazed with bright, colorful finishes that made the pieces look festive and appealing. But the glazes on many of these pottery pieces contained high levels of lead. Lead was used in traditional pottery glazes because it made the colors brighter, the finish shinier, and the glaze easier to apply. Potters in developing countries often used lead-based glazes because they were cheap and readily available. The lead was safe as long as the pottery was used for decorative purposes only, but when acidic foods, tomatoes, citrus, vinegar, pickles, were stored in lead-glazed pottery, the acid leached lead out of the glaze and into the food. Children were especially vulnerable because their developing brains absorbed lead more readily than adults. In the 1970s, poor families bought cheap vanilla extract, imitation vanilla flavoring, and vanilla-flavored foods that contained coumarin, a naturally occurring chemical compound found in tonka beans, cassia cinnamon, and sweet clover. Coumarin had a sweet vanilla-like aroma and was used as a cheap substitute for real vanilla in imitation vanilla extracts, baked goods, candies, and desserts. A bottle of coumarin-based imitation vanilla cost 49 cents compared to $2 for real vanilla extract. Poor families bought the cheap imitation vanilla because it smelled and tasted similar enough to the real thing and cost a fraction of the price. In the 1970s and 2000s, poor families bought fresh alfalfa sprouts, bean sprouts, and other raw sprouts at grocery stores and salad bars because they were cheap, nutritious, and filling. A container of fresh sprouts cost 99 cents and could be added to sandwiches, salads, stir-fries, and wraps to add crunch, flavor, and vitamins. Sprouts were especially popular among health-conscious families and vegetarians who wanted affordable plant-based protein. 25 banned groceries. 25 foods poor families bought when paychecks ran short and cupboards ran bare. Cyclamate sodas that cost half as much. Lung meat at 20 cents a pound. Red Dye No. 2 foods that made cheap groceries look appealing. Sassafras root bark brewed into penny per cup tea. Raw milk straight from the dairy for 79 cents a gallon. Violet stamped meat, orange hot dogs, bright red cherries, canned fruits in cyclamate syrup, trans-fat margarine spread on every slice of toast. Red cake mixes for 49 cents. Grape drinks flavored with banned chemicals. Sulfite-sprayed produce, lead-soldered cans, unpasteurized cheese, Red Dye No. 3 candy, partially hydrogenated oils in every snack, mineral oil-coated rice, brominated sodas, potassium bromate bread, saccharin under threat of ban, debt-contaminated fish caught from local waters, lead-glazed pottery storing tonight's dinner, coumarin vanilla in bargain bottles, raw sprouts added to stretch salads. Every single one of these groceries kept poor families fed when money was tight and choices were few. They weren't luxuries. They were survival. They were what you could afford when the rent was due and the kids were hungry and the paycheck wouldn't stretch any further. Poor families trusted these foods because the government said they were safe, because stores sold them on every shelf, because everyone else was eating them too. The foods that kept poor families alive were the same foods that poisoned them slowly, meal by meal, year by year. These 25 banned groceries are gone now, but the families who ate them remember. Before the last generation forgets, share your memory. Which banned grocery did your family buy when money ran short? Drop a comment below. Keep the memory alive before it disappears forever.